So today I'm Levi Turner. I'm a senior technical support engineer here in the Raleigh office. My main focus has been primarily on Qlik server, and I've been in the company for almost 3 years, pretty close there. So what we're going to cover today is the concept of a floating central node. Like, what does that mean in practical reality? How to fail over and fail back, both automatically and programmatically using APIs. We're going to go over a live demonstration where we're going to work through that workflow doing the API calls, and we'll also briefly touch on troubleshooting, and then move on to architectural implications of what this means and how we would expect sites to be architected using this functionality. So the concept of a floating central node, what is it? So prior to the June release, the central node and its responsibilities, they were statically assigned to a node. This meant that in a lot of deployments that were larger and the central node had no responsibilities, that it'd be a small VM, 4-core, 8-core, 8 gig, 16 gig. I mean, it's not doing much. It's just sitting there. But those responsibilities include coordinating reloads, being the master scheduler. This is one way. There are multiple ways of doing this. But the central node does deliver extensions. It does UDC lookups, and it does some other things like handling licensing and a couple of other sort of marginal things that you never really notice. But it required the central node to be statically assigned. It had to be up for the site to really function. So with the June release, you now have the option of configuring a non-central node to be what is called a failover candidate. And this is something that it's ideal to do on a new node, not an existing node. The reason behind that is that when you add a RIM node, they get a copy of certificates so they can communicate with all the nodes, because all the traffic between nodes and inside of a node is encrypted using the self-generated certificates that are created upon installation. But traditionally with RIM nodes, they had a limited copy of that underlying certificate. They would have a trusted root without a private key, so it couldn't be used to generate new keys. It could just validate trust. So with this failover candidate, it needs to have a full copy of the certificates, because it can take over all the responsibilities, including adding new creating new certs if you're doing some sort of authentication integration or API calls. Also adding RIM nodes. So it needs to have that done. So it's ideal to do this on a new node, which you can always delete the node, uninstall, reinstall. Especially if you're in shared persistence, this process is relatively quick and relatively painless. You don't lose anything other than some configuration. So what does failover mean? Failover means inside of Sense that another predefined or already set up node will take over the responsibilities of the original central node if the central node were to be down. And by down, I mean the repository service is not running. Those responsibilities, I listed them earlier, but they're extensions, UDC lookups, coordinating reloads, and licenses as well. And the main reason why you'd want to utilize this functionality is to add resiliency to your architecture. Recently, a couple of days ago, we saw a customer ask about or complaining about patching. You know, patching, you have to stop services, reboot a box. Windows patching, and if you have a failover candidate, right, you can just fail over to a new node, patch the original central, come back up, fail back over to the original central, and then patch the secondary one. It also simplifies the architecture a little bit. You don't need to have that stand-in central node doing nothing there. So practically, how does this work? So by default, if you have a failover candidate set up in the QMC, after 10 minutes of downtime on the central, services will automatically fail over to one of the failover candidates. If you have multiple, whichever one makes the request first will take care of that. So that's the default way. 10 minutes of downtime, which for most sites, if you care about this type of functionality, that's not an acceptable amount of downtime. So there are other ways to do this. You can also adjust this value. And I'll demo this using API calls. So some notes here. This value, it is written in minutes, so the lowest you can go is 1 minute. And also, you should be conscientious about the fact that you don't necessarily want things to fail over all the time. There's going to be some disruption to the end users, which I'll go over in the demo. Basically, the proxy service needs to restart to take new settings. So there'll be a brief blip in sort of availability of the application to the end user. So setting this too low is not super ideal, because if the site fails over just due to a random network blip, there will be some pain to the end users. This is intended to be sort of a way to save a site when it's having significant problems, not being governed by random network blips that you as the application administrator have no control over. The other way to do this, and this is what I'll primarily focus on in demo, is via an API call. It's a pretty simple post call, saying it's an empty post call, and I'll demo the exact path and the exact workflow using Postman, but any API tool will work. But it's going to be QRS, failover, to node, and then the GUID of the node that you want to go to. And that server node GUID is accessible in the QMC, or if you're going down the API route, there's also an API path that you can use. So if you wanted to fail back, it's going to be the reverse. You'll send it back to the original node using the server node GUID. It's a relatively straightforward process, that part. And so practically, what does this mean for customers and partners? If you're really trying to leverage this functionality, right, you really would like to have a way of gauging the uptime of a site. And whether it's responsive. So there is an endpoint, SSL/ping. By the way, this does need to be accessed via 4242, the QRS API port. You have to go directly to the repository for this. But this API path will give a successful response if the site's up. And I should be able to quickly demo that. And basically on a period of non-responsiveness, you'll fail over via a series of API calls. So you'll have to script some sort of solution out there for yourself. But if you've gotten down the QRS path and started playing with APIs, this is relatively straightforward. So we'll go ahead and do a live demo of what this means. And if you'll give me a second, I will pull up a set of servers. So let's reconnect to make the resolution bigger. Okay. So this is a Qlik Sense site, and let me make the text a little bigger. We have 3 nodes named primary, secondary, and consume. The consume node, it has all services, but practically speaking, it is intended to be a proxy and engine node. This is delivering an application to a pseudo end user. And right now, I'm authenticated using that proxy and that engine, and I've got a very basic application that I'm playing around with. And these are the primary and secondary nodes. The secondary node, it is configured to be a failover candidate, which is visible in the QMC. And the part I mentioned about the GUIDs, if you just display the ID field, it'll show the server node GUID. But let's pretend that this site went down. I've got a little batch file that I'll run that'll just stop the repository service and all the dependency services on this node. But let's pretend this is on a server that it's on a VM, the host crashed, or they had an OS problem, ran out of disk space, whatever. Whatever reason why that site has gone down. But that site is functionally down. So at this point, services are stopping, and once the repository service goes down, we'll be able to see things a little clearer. And let's go ahead and refresh. Doesn't respond. The other thing that is done by the central is that the QMC is delivered via the central node, so it has to be up to work. Right now, I'm going to use the proxy on the node 3, but I'm going to go into the QMC, or try to, and I'll get this odd error, and it'll be non-functional, and things won't work. So let's pretend this is the site. How would we fail over? So I've got a Postman series of API calls set up. And so this command is going to be going to Qlik server 2 because Qlik server 2 is active. I couldn't go to 1, right? The repository service is not there to respond. Going directly over 4242. And I'm going to do QRS failover to node and the GUID that I had pre-recorded. And some other, a transfer key, the appropriate headers set up in here. As a note, if you're doing API calls, it's ideal to not use an internal account, but if you're using an internal account, SA API makes it a little easier. That internal account was created for the express purpose of doing API calls rather than doing a SA repository, which is used internally inside services. So in the logs, you can actually see this account making the request. But I'm going to go ahead and send this post response, and the body here is empty. I've got nothing here. And I send a response. I get a 204 no content response from the server, which means successful in this case. And if I were to refresh the QMC, it works. And we see this node is offline, 505, 505. And over here, this is what I mentioned earlier, that it's not painless for the end user. The proxy service on this node briefly restarted and got new settings from the new central node. So I can just click refresh and go back in. This works. I'm on Windows authentication. With other authentication modes, this may not be possible. So it's something that you will need to consider. What are the implications for the setup you have here? And I'm back in my site, and I'm able to play around with this application, even though the previous central node was down, which traditionally inside of Qlik Sense, that would have been very painful. Like we would have had to debug why it went down, restart the server. There are a lot of options to try to get a site back up, but it would have been painful, whereas this one is relatively quick. So in terms of, over here, in terms of the log entry, for troubleshooting this, it's going to primarily write to the program data Qlik Sense log repository trace and then system repository log. That's the most verbose log of pretty much every service. And in this one, we'll see here that it was assigned right here. It was started failing over from this node, and it took several responsibilities: the schedule master, user sync, app management, and also it is the one that cleans up the database in modern builds where that is very functional. But yeah, that's the brief overview of how to do that. The other thing I wanted to demo is how to adjust that failover value. So the failover value, let's go ahead and do a GET request at this QRS service cluster full endpoint. And we'll see here that the failover timeout value is defined as 10 minutes here. So if we wanted to adjust this to a lower value, let's say we wanted to adjust it to 2, let's go ahead and take this text JSON response. We're going to adjust the modified date just slightly. Add another second, and we will adjust the failover timeout value to 2 minutes, and we will do a put response to this ID. This ID is discernible from here, and we will go ahead and put that back in, and server 2, since that's up, and we get a 200 OK response. And if we were to go back into the QMC service cluster, the failover value is now at 2 minutes. So it's a relatively straightforward process once you have your API interface to the repository set up. With this one, I'm using certificates. I'm on the server itself, so it's relatively easy. But there are articles, and it's relatively painless to set up either Postman. You can use Qlik CLI, which is a PowerShell repository for doing API calls. There are a variety of options for accessing the APIs. So in troubleshooting, it's logged, as I mentioned before, in the repository trace system log, which is really the most verbose one. But from our standpoint, we haven't seen many customers run into issues. So outside of that, I don't have much guidance. But let's move on to the architectural implications. What does this mean for customers and partners? How will you design a site utilizing this functionality? So let's go over some brief review of the Qlik Sense 1.x and 2.x, or 3.1 and 3.2x enterprise architectures. And by the way, this is all assuming shared persistence, because if you're trying to design for resiliency and robustness, high-ish availability, disaster recovery, et cetera, without shared persistence, you're really not going to add much value there. You really can't restore a central node from a RIM using async persistence. And as you guys may have encountered, sync persistence has its own problems. That's why it became the new default in the June 2017 release, and going on to the September release as well. So this is a sort of generic site. We've got a central node that this delivers the applications and also hosts the database. A couple of in-user consume nodes. They have a proxy and an engine. We've got a reload node, so reloads would go there, and then we've got this author dev node. It's not uncommon in a load balancer out front. This is sort of a generic setup. There are a lot of other options. Some of this is taken from the presentation that I did previously on share persistence, but there are other options inside without failover to add resiliency to the site. And in this scenario, we've got stream replication for Postgres that's replicating to another box, and then DFS going to another box as well. And that DFS is a single write master. And another option, we have Windows clustering for persistence. You can also have potentially Windows clustering on the central. The difficulty from the support standpoint, right, is that we're not Microsoft, so we can't help you through that process, but customers have done it. And so that is an option. But and this is a bit more of a robust option. We have Windows clustering on the central, and then a SAN hosting both of those, both the persistence layer, the database, and the apps, and then the central node as well. And so using some sort of SAN device or network storage is ideal, because if that goes down inside an organization, you typically have bigger problems than just your BI tool. So they're engineered for high availability. So what does it mean for June 2017 and above? The reliance on the central as a placeholder is removed. So we're going to expect to see more beefy central nodes that are serving as schedulers. This is not dissimilar to in QlikView. We would expect to see QMS hosted on the QDS box. So the management service runs with the distribution service or publisher, because those are back-end activities. It's not a front-end activity. Front-end activity would be the delivery end-user content. Back-end would be managing the site and doing reloads and getting new data. So this is a generic site, sort of moved along. The only real change here is that the reload node now is a secondary central. Not much has changed here. But this next slide is going to look a little different. So rather than having that everything flowing through a central node, a sort of standalone central node, now we have a primary and a secondary node. These are both potential central nodes. There's no need to have a filler value there. We've got a consume nodes out front, and then we have a SAN on the back end for the apps and Postgres for resiliency there. So now we've got Sense that has resiliency baked in without doing Windows clustering, in addition to resiliency for the applications and the database. So if you guys have any questions, please use the Q&A panel, and I will start looking over them in just a second. So we have a question about the mobile app. I'll see if I can find an answer to that, but I don't recall offhand. So we have a question here about end users with bookmarks and stories. The question is, users lose selections when failover occurs. What happens to bookmarks? So I mean, bookmarks are just applied selections, right? So insofar as selections are removed, then bookmarks would be not applied. In terms of stories, there aren't selections there. There's no session state for a user. The only potential other impact would be if a user is in the process of making a change to an application, adding a sheet, editing an expression, adding a visualization object, and hasn't saved their changes, that could possibly be lost. But in terms of stories, I don't see any potential impact there, because there's no session state for that user. It's just like accessing a sheet. There's a question here about versions, whether 3.1 is June 2017 and 3.2 is September 2017. So no, 3.1 and 3.2 are builds of QlikSense that have been out for a little while now. I think 3.1 initially came out in September or so of last year from memory. So with the release of the June 2017 release, which is sometimes also called 4.0, Qlik has gone in a slightly different direction. with its release schedule and naming conventions. In printing, I know is going to be using this Qlik view, I imagine, but don't know. I'm not in that every day. But after June, the releases will be named month, year. So June 2017, September 2017. You can think of these in terms of 4.0 and 5.0, but practically that's not exactly how it is. It's more analogous to 4.0 and 4.1. And there will be patches issued on top of those base releases. So there's 2 patches for the June 2017 release. These patches are intended to be very low weight. They're intended to be similar to a Windows patch. You apply a patch, a security update to Windows. It goes into the updates panel on the OS, and you can optionally uninstall that without removing the base program. I think this one is just the base 2017, but if I were to have installed a patch here, I would have a Qlik update here. So they're updates. So 3.1 and 3.2, those are older releases, and the June release and the September release, those are the newer ones. There's a question about the share persistence presentation, and I can provide that in a little bit.
Yeah, that is available on Qlik Community and in the support portal. So you can find it in both locations.
And Troy can correct me, but I think if you have access to this presentation, you would see all the links to the old ones.
Yeah.
So I think there's some questions about Postman, and there should be some support articles about how to use Postman. There's a question here about we don't use SAN or storage as part, and storage is maintained as part of the central node. Is there a way to handle the situation when the central node goes down? No. So inside of this architecture, we're assuming that the Postgres database, wherever it is, and the applications and the extensions as well, that those will remain up. So if everything's on the central node, the database and the applications, the site's going to be functionally down. So this architecture assumes some layer of some sort of dedicated persistence layer. So having, back to the slide, having something like this, or this is assumed here. We have a question here about automatic failover. So automatic failover is already baked in, but the value is set to 10 minutes. I went through a workflow of how to adjust that to a lower value, so you can still do that. You can set it at 2 minutes or potentially a minute if you have a robust network. But with cautions, you definitely should test that out given the variability in networks. But you can do that automatically, yes. Best practices for failover in a virtualized environment. I don't think that would be different than a physical environment. I don't see quite how that would matter per se. The only main value of a virtualized environment is that you have an easy way of restoring things. You can do restoring snapshots relatively quickly depending on your infrastructure team. And so I don't see any difference there really. Do we expect a SR3 or patch 3 for June 2017? The word that I've received from R&D is that it's likely, but not guaranteed. We'll have to see what issues arise, what customers have issues that just need to be fixed there. Question about licensing. Inside of QlikSense, unlike QlikView, there's no node requirements or no node requirements. In QlikView, it's provisioned in the left, number of cluster nodes. In QlikSense, there is no restriction, so there's no impact of licensing that I'm aware of. Question about switching over. So is there another way to switch? It's either automatic, so 10 minutes or an adjusted value, or via APIs. Those are the only ones that I'm aware of. Can you store the repository folder on a SAN drive? The value of that, so if you're trying to utilize that functionality, this style of functionality, you'd want to install Postgres independently of QlikSense. I'm unaware of a way that you can install the QlikSense repository database on a SAN drive and nothing else. there's another question here about failing back. There's no automated failback. There's automated failover, and sort of conceptually, architecturally, right? In this style here, this is sort of the primary way that Qlik support, and as I understand it, consulting and pre-sales are thinking about this. Whether the responsibilities are on the primary or the secondary doesn't matter. So there's no failback. Question here about ideal to host on the scheduler node. Architecturally, it makes sense. There's no restriction on which nodes can be it. You can have all your nodes be set up as failover candidates if you so desire. Architecturally, it makes sense to have back-end activities on back-end servers and front-end activities on front-end servers, right? You don't want the central node to potentially be impacted by some user or some developer, right, selecting star and blowing out the RAM and CPU of an engine node. Whereas back-end activities are a bit more controlled. There's a question about NAS support. So that's something that it's not in September. It's been assumed for quite some time. I'll follow up with you separately, but basically NAS devices are supported insofar as they meet certain requirements in terms of latency and IOPS. There is an article on the support site about that. But I'll follow up with you individually. So do ping your email so I can send you the article name. But it should be QlikSense and NAS. The title is, if I recall correctly. Question about using APIs to fail over, and it's not automatic. It can be automatic. I just did not want to wait for 10 minutes. That is a poor use of time. But it would fail over after 10 minutes with the default values. And there's a question about upgrades to the June release. You can upgrade to the June release. You don't have to have a fresh install. And in fact, there was a previous presentation by Andrew Delaney, I think, about upgrading to share persistence. So the big difference between prior builds and the June release is that the June release is share persistence only. So some customers have had some issues. There are no more growing pains about going to share persistence. You know, you have to put your applications on a certain path that has to be UNC shared, and it has to be accessible by all the nodes in the environment. But he's got a presentation on upgrading to share persistence. So if you are not already on share persistence, that presentation will be just as relevant on the June release as it will be on the prior builds. And if you already are on share persistence, the upgrade is relatively painless. You know, just make sure you have backups as normal, and you should be good to go there. Question about QVD generators, reloading data. So, I mean, the reloads will fail insofar as they require the files that exist on the central node. In this architecture, we're assuming some level of utilizing that SAN, not just for the applications, the extensions, and the archive logs, but also for the QVDs. So having the QVDs off of any particular QlikSense node. So the question about moving the share path, in the June release, the tool that would do this was removed. That tool, if you have a copy of that exe, that can be used on the June release. And if not, then check our knowledge base, put your email in there. I'll write an article about that if there isn't one already. There should be one, because there's a tool in the September release that includes a lot of new functionality, including RSM-like activity, as well as changing the share path and all that other fun stuff.
Thank you very much, everyone, for attending. I hope you enjoyed this session. Thank you, Levi, for presenting. We've got a legal disclaimer for you. And that's it. Thank you once again, and have a great rest of your day.